So let's start with this first page is slope. There are some from graphs, some from one from the equation. Do we have any questions on this page? Number 2 and number 4. Okay. If we can do like one of each type, I think that will benefit you greatly. And then if we have specific questions, then we'll go back and do them. Okay, so for number 2, if you're trying to find the slope from a graph, you need to find 2 points from this line that crosses the grid lines exactly. So we have to look, where does this cross the background grid line? Severe. Not quite. It's like, it's super close. -4. But at -4, -1, that's 1 point. Where's the other? So 0, 4. I'm just gonna write those just so we know what those points were. But if we're finding it from a graph, the only thing we need to do is count. So whether you start here or here doesn't matter, but we have to go up or down first. So if we start here, we're gonna go up 5, and then we're gonna go to the right 4. So our slope would be 5/4. That is all you have to do for this one. So make sure you're counting correctly, double check it. If there are multiple points, count that same slope to the next set of points. If they're not the same, you may have counted incorrectly. Right. Number 4 is an equation. You have to know which number in that equation is the slope. 6. -1/2. Make sure you're putting m equal so that we know slope is this. Right, go on to the next page. If we have questions about 7, 8, or 9, we can do one of those, and then 10 through 14, we can do one of those. Seven through 9, any of those you want to go over questions about? It should be this very next page, like the back of. It says 32 pages. No, it's brown. Interesting. Some of them have them, some of it don't. Okay. Can you see that? So it goes to this one? Okay, so let's see if. Go a couple more pages until you see when that looks like. This one? Should have that page, I'm hoping. Because then we could do some of those from this. So the ones that were similar to the ones I was just talking about are 5 through 8 or 11 and 12. Questions on any of those? Do we have any questions on 5 through 8, 11, or 12? A beer. Six. Ivan, what were you gonna say?
I'll say, 9.
9. Okay. That's 8. You're right. 9 is gonna be just like the one we just did. Where your slope is from. 4, 6. We need to know our slope formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. If you forget what that is, you can find it on this word wall / in the vocab, either or, you can come up and look for it. Label these x1, y1, x2, y2. So if I put this in -8 minus -8 over -20 minus 8. Now you could put this all in your calculator at once. Many of you do not have your calculator. Go grab that. Okay. So if you want to put all of this in at the same time in your calculator, you're gonna hit alpha y equals the calculator over here. And you could type that all in. Alpha y equals, put this in the numerator, this in the denominator while you're doing that. And this is loading. I'm gonna do it with my hand. We need to simplify always. So if you put it in your calculator all at once, it'll simplify it for you. This is 0. If you did it the way I did it, you would just need to know that this is 0. Jacob, you were saying do number 12. Questions on 6, we're going to do 12. So if this is a y equals, anytime you see a y equals just a number by itself, or an x equals just a number by itself, somewhere off to the side, or come up here and look, you should be thinking about your FOIBA. Horizontal lines have 0 slope in our y equals, vertical lines have undefined slope in our x equals. So if this is a y equals, what is the slope? 0. For those type of questions, if you put anything other than 0 or undefined, it is incorrect. For slope only. Questions on 12 before we move on to objective 2. So now in objective 2, we have writing equations from a graph. Do we have questions on 13 or 14 or 15 or 16? So when you're given a graph, you have to find your slope, find your y-intercept, write those two up to the side if it helps, and then put that in your equation. So just like when we were finding slope of the other one, we have to do the same thing. Look for 2 points that cross the grid lines exactly. I'm going to give you a bunch. 1, 2, 3. Be careful, because some of these look like they cross the grid lines exactly, but they're a little off, like the tiniest bit off. Okay, so let's count our slope. We're gonna go up 6 and to the right 5. We're gonna have a positive slope 6/5. Make sure you go up or down before you go left or right, so that the up goes on top. And then what is your y-intercept? -2. Then we can use those two numbers in your y equals mx plus b. The y equals your m is 6/5. Then don't forget your x, and then your b is negative. Don't put plus and then minus. If it's negative, just put minus. Questions on that one? Go on to the next page. Right, 17 and 18 are writing the slope, intercept form when given the slope and intercept, so kind of like what we just did, but without the graph. Do we have questions on 17 or 18? Want to do either of those? 18 first. Right, so when you see something like this, it has to be in your y equals mx plus b format. Slope is your m, so that goes in front. Y-intercept is your b, so that goes out. If either one is a negative, make sure you put that negative in there, or the minus if it's the y-intercept. Next part is being able to write the slope intercept form when you have a point and your slope. So now we're using our point slope formula. Amir.
You always simplify the slope.
Yes. So if you're given the slope, there's nothing to do, simplifying wise, but on a graph, yes, Jacob.
I do 15.
15 short. Let's, yeah, we can do that. So this is a vertical line, going straight up and down. Vertical line, I should be thinking about my move ups. Vertical line.
Yeah.
If we're writing the equation, not finding the slope, so make sure you pay attention to the definition, to the description. This is going to be an x equals. What number does x equal? Negative. So the slope is undefined, but that's not what we're writing here. We're trying to find the equation of the line for this one. So try not to get those confused. Right, 19 or 20, which of those do we want to see to 19? Okay. Right, again, this is another formula that if you've forgotten, it's on the boards. You can go back and find that. I'm gonna write it y minus y1 equals m parentheses x minus x1. So if you don't remember it, please go look and see what is that formula. Okay, you have a point, that's your x1, y1, your slope is your m. Then we're gonna put all of those in. The y and the x stay just y and x. So y minus, we have a -1 equals our slope 3/2, parentheses, the x is x minus 0. Now, some of you may have already made this a plus, but you have to make it a plus before you do anything else. We can also distribute this at the same time. You have 3/2x. This would just become 0. You can put the plus 0, you don't need it, it's up to you. But the last step is to get y by itself. By doing what? Subtracting 1 to both sides. I'm gonna write this off to the side. So y equals 3/2x minus 1 would be the final equation. All of your final equations should be in that format. If it still looks like something like this, you're not finished. Questions on 19 before we do one of 21 or 22? Which of those would we rather do, 21 or 22? 22. Right. When you are given 2 points, you're still doing this same process, but you have to find the slope first. So kind of like what we just did for slope. label this x1, y1, x2, y2. And let's find our slope, -1 minus a -1, all over -4 minus 1. You can either do that by hand or in the calculator. Go ahead and calculate that, tell me what you get. Just like the last slope we did, these cancel to become 0. If you get a problem like this, you can still use this process, or you can think about your $4. I'll show both ways. So if we're using this process, we need to pick one of these points. It does not matter which one. I'm just gonna go with this one. And use this point and this slope in this equation. So we have y minus a -1 equals our slope 0, parentheses x minus 1. Just as we did for that last problem, we need to make the minus negative a plus. We can also distribute the 0, but what happens when we do that? Everything equals 0. So you wouldn't put 0x plus 0, you would just put 0. There's nothing else left on that side. Everything becomes 0. And then we just subtract 1. So that would be doing it with the formula. But if you recognize that your slope is 0, well, I know in $4, the y equal has a 0 slope. So if I look at my y value, that would tell me this is going to be y equals -1. And then you wouldn't have to show work at all. But that's for these specific ones. Do you have any questions about that one? The same thing would work for undefined, except for undefined, you cannot do this process at all. It will not work. You'll have undefined in for the slopes, but you can't distribute undefined anywhere. Okay, so now let's go on to graphing. We have 23 through 26. Any of those we want to see do go over?
Three.
Okay. So if we are graphing, we have to graph the slope and the y-intercept, fill it up with as many points as possible, draw a straight line. So what's our y-intercept for this? 0. You can put the +0 if it helps, but you're gonna put a point right at 0. When you go to take the quiz, if you want a ruler, feel free to grab that, but right now we don't have time. Our slope is negative. What directions could we go to get a negative slope?
Down.
Down and left. Both of those are negative, so we couldn't use both at the same time, but we could use them separately. But down and right would make it a negative. If you use down and left, you're gonna go down and left, and then keep going like that, but this is gonna be a positive slope. So we gotta do the opposite. Only one of the directions can be negative. So we can go down to the left one, to the right one, sorry, as many times as possible. Go back to your y-intercept and go up to and left one as many times as possible. And then draw a line through everything, connecting all your points. Yes. 24, yes. If this is an x equals, what are we gonna be using? The $4. You're gonna use it so much, you're gonna get sick of it. So the x equals, it's gonna be a vertical line. Vertical up and down, so put a point at 2 when x equals 2 and draw a vertical up and down line through that. Let's go on to objective 4 on the next page. Questions 27 through 30. You said 27. Start with that one. So if we are identifying the x and y intercepts, this is one where we have to put 0 in for both and then solve, but not at the same time. So let's say I'm solving for x, I would put 0 in for y. I would drop this middle section completely because that's going to be 0. And I'm going to solve for x. Divide both sides by 5. But after you get that answer, you have to write it as an ordered pair. X always comes first. You're solving for x, y is always going to be 0. And then opposite for y. We put 0 in for x now. We could drop this. Divide by -3 on both sides. And then write that as an ordered pair. Anytime we're solving for y, x is 0. And just make sure you label what I'm doing. Okay. If we have questions on 28, 29, or 30, we will do that very quickly when we get back from lunch. Okay. Quickly, do you have any other questions on 27? Guys, go back to your seats. Did we have questions on 28, 29, or 30?
Can you do 30?
30, we're just finding the x and y intercepts. So look at where does it cross the y-axis, where does it cross the x-axis? Write those as ordered pairs. For the y-intercept, this would be 0, 4. For the x-intercept, this would be at 6, 0. Make sure you label which one is which. This is the x-intercept, this is the y-intercept. Questions on 28 or 29? So that you have enough time to finish your quiz. Any phones and smartwatches put up in calculator pockets. Just as before, it is collaborative / you can use your notes. So use your notes if you have them. If you don't, you can't get someone else's notes. You can use each other, yes. You can listen to music with your phone, some music right there. So everyone's everyone needs to get up, go put their phone back in the calculator pocket. Grab your calculator if you do not have it.